The silence was a presence, a weight that settled in the lungs and chilled the skin. It was the first thing he always registered upon waking, not the filtered, recycled air tasting of ozone and antiseptic, nor the soft, seamless fabric of the bedding that clung to him without warmth. It was the silence, a perfect, engineered void where the messy, unpredictable sounds of life were scrubbed clean. He was a creature of this void, assembled from its quiet pressures and sterile expectations. He lay still, his eyes tracing the faint, luminous lines that formed a grid on the ceiling, a map of his confinement. Each intersection was a point of data, a coordinate in the carefully managed geography of his existence. He was subject 734. He was an asset, and assets did not make noise. They did not dream. They did not remember. But the memories were there, swimming in the deep, dark water behind his eyes, fractured things of light and sound and the coppery tang of fear. They were not his, not really. They were echoes he had absorbed, psychic shrapnel from the last deployment. A woman's scream, thin and sharp as breaking glass, the low thrum of a crowd's simmering panic, a beast stirring in its sleep, the sudden, shocking silence that came after. He had been the silence. He had been the calm. The facility called it a successful pacification. He called it a hollowing. His body was a stranger's country. He moved a hand, watching the fingers flex, pale and long, against the stark white of the sheet. There was a tremor in them, a faint, high-frequency vibration that was not his own, a residual resonance. He was an instrument, and the last note played upon him still lingered, a dissonant hum in his bones. The door to his containment unit slid open with a sigh of compressed air, a sound so familiar it was part of the silence itself. He did not turn his head. He did not need to. He could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere, the subtle displacement of air, the introduction of a new, complex scent into the sterile environment. It was a scent of chemical astringents and starched fabric, but beneath it, something else, something organic and troubled. The scent of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike, and the faint, almost imperceptible fragrance of dry earth and wilting leaves. It was the scent of Dr. Aris Thorne. The doctor's footsteps were measured, soft-soled on the polished floor, each one a carefully placed beat in the rhythm of control. He stopped beside the bio-bed. Elian kept his gaze fixed on the ceiling grid. To look at the doctor was to invite engagement, and engagement was a currency he could not afford to spend. Subject 734, Dr. Thorne's voice was as he remembered it, a low, calm baritone, smoothed by professional detachment. It was a voice designed to soothe, to command, to document. It was not a voice for conversation. Report your status. Elian drew a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the cool air fill the empty spaces inside him. Stable. The word was a pebble dropped into a deep well. It was the only word required of him. Vitals are within expected parameters, the doctor continued, his voice a murmur as he scanned the readouts on the floating display beside the bed. Neurological activity shows residual synaptic stress, expected but notable. There was a soft click as he made a notation with a stylus. The light from the display cast his face in a cool, blue-white glow, sharpening the angles of his jaw, deepening the shadows beneath his eyes. He looked tired. He always looked tired. But today, the exhaustion seemed to have sunk deeper into the very structure of his bones. Elian finally allowed his eyes to drift from the ceiling, down the stark white wall to the doctor's hands. Dr. Thorne was adjusting a sensor on Elian's temple, his movements precise, economical, but his fingers, long and elegant, trembled. It was not a violent shake, not a tremor born of palsy or weakness. It was a fine, barely visible vibration, a humming tension that betrayed the calm of his voice and the stillness of his posture. A live wire, insulated but carrying a lethal current. Elian had noticed it before, this subtle dissonance. It had grown more pronounced in recent weeks. A crack in the perfect, sterile facade of the facility, a flaw in the man who was its most trusted physician. There are no signs of psychic contagion, Dr. Thorne stated, his gaze fixed on the monitor. The empathetic feedback loop was successfully severed post-mission. He was speaking to the recording device, to the official record. He was not speaking to the man on the bed. The man on the bed was not a man. He was subject 734. He was a vessel. He was a weapon that bled feelings instead of blood. The doctor's hand moved away from his temple, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Aris Thorne's eyes were the color of a winter sky, a pale, depthless grey that concealed everything and nothing. In them, Elian saw a flicker of something that was not clinical, not detached, a deep, abyssal weariness, a fear so profound it had become a part of his biology. The doctor's gaze dropped first. He cleared his throat, a small, rough sound in the silent room. "You need rest," he said, the words clipped, formal. He turned back to the display, his shoulders rigid. The recovery protocol requires a minimum of 72 hours of monitored inactivity. It was a dismissal, an order. But the words hung in the air, freighted with an irony so heavy it was almost visible. You need rest. The directive came from a man whose own hands betrayed a spirit so unquiet it threatened to shake his carefully constructed world apart. Elian watched those hands, watched the tremor that ran through them like a captured ghost. He was the one confined to this bed, this room, this life. He was the one who had absorbed the terror of 1,000 minds and processed it into a placid, terrifying calm. But as he watched the doctor, a cold, clear thought surfaced from the deep water of his consciousness. He was not the only prisoner in this room. He was not the only one who desperately needed rest. And he was not the only one who would never, ever find it. The silence returned, thicker now, filled with the unspoken truth of the doctor's shaking hands. It was a silence that screamed. The doctor's scent, that strange and compelling mix of sterile lab and dying earth, lingered long after the door hissed shut. It was a discordant note in the room's symphony of nothingness, a question without an answer. Elian closed his eyes, letting the darkness swallow the luminous grid on the ceiling. He tried to sink back into the prescribed emptiness, the meditative state of non-being that the facility encouraged. It was a survival mechanism. To feel nothing was to be safe. But the image of Dr. Thorne's trembling hands was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. It was a flaw in the system, a human error in a world of perfect machinery, and it called to a part of him he thought had been excised long ago, the part that felt curiosity, the part that recognized pain in another. He turned his head on the pillow, the movement slow and languid, and inhaled, drawing the last vestiges of the doctor's scent deep into his lungs, the faint, tragic perfume of a wilting plant in a room with no sun. It smelled like a secret. It smelled like despair. A low-frequency hum started deep within the walls, the precursor to the nutrient cycle. It was a sound he knew as well as his own breathing. It was the sound of his continued existence meted out in carefully calibrated doses of protein and electrolytes. The hum vibrated through the frame of the bio bed, a mechanical pulse against his spine, and as it did, it snagged on a thread of memory, pulling it loose from the tangled knot of his last deployment. The memory was not a clean, linear narrative. It was a maelstrom of sensory input. The hum of the facility's machinery dissolved into the low, angry growl of a crowd. The sterile air thickened, becoming humid and heavy with the smell of sweat, of stale food, of unwashed bodies packed too tightly together. The riot in Sector Gamma 9, a protest over resource allocation that had spiraled into violence. He had been deployed remotely, his consciousness projected into the central square through a network of sonic emitters and atmospheric regulators. He had not been there in body, but he had been there in mind, in every mind. He remembered the feeling of 1,000 anxieties crashing into him at once, a tsunami of desperation, anger, and the bitter, acidic taste of injustice. He was the epicenter. He was the empathic sink. His purpose was to absorb it all, to take their rage and fear and metabolize it into apathy, into compliance. He remembered the face of a young woman at the front of the crowd, her features sharp with defiance, her voice raw from shouting. He had focused on her first. He had reached into her mind, not with force, but with a gentle, insidious touch like water seeping into stone. He had found the root of her anger, a sick child, a lack of medicine, a future shrinking to a pinprick of light, and he had smoothed it. He had wrapped her righteous fury in a blanket of soft, grey exhaustion. He had told her, without words, that the fight was too hard, that the anger was too heavy, that she needed rest. Her face had gone slack. The fire in her eyes had dimmed to a dull ember. The protest banner had slipped from her fingers. One by one, he had moved through the crowd, a ghost of placidity, a plague of peace. He had silenced them all. The memory ended with the same sound, a perfect, engineered silence where 1,000 desperate voices had been, a hollowing. The hum in the walls ceased. A panel slid open near his head, and a thin tube extended, the tip glowing with a faint blue light. The nutrient paste, tasteless, efficient, lifeless. As the tube neared his lips, the scent of the doctor, ozone, and dry earth flared in his mind, a phantom sensation. The juxtaposition was jarring. The lifeless sustenance offered by the machine, and the scent of a life, however troubled, that had stood beside him moments before. The sensory conflict triggered something new, not a memory of his own actions, but a psychic echo from the doctor himself. The connection, usually dormant and suppressed by his medication, fled to life, a sudden, blinding flash of insight. For a single, terrifying second, he was not in his own head. He was in Dr. Iris Thorne's. He saw his own still form on the bed, but through the doctor's eyes. He saw not an asset, not subject 734, but a pale, fragile boy drowning in a sea of white. And he felt it, the thing that made the doctor's hands shake. It was not simple fear. It was a complex, layered terror, cold and sharp as surgical steel. It was the horror of complicity. It was the crushing weight of a memory, not Elian's memory of the riot, but Iris's memory of another subject, another Omega empath strapped to a table, a memory of screaming, not from a crowd, but from a single, overloaded mind, a memory of the smell of burning synapses, of a life extinguishing itself like a faulty circuit. And beneath the terror, a suffocating guilt, a self-loathing so potent it was a physical sickness. I am a monster. I am a cage builder. I am watching it happen all over again. The psychic contact lasted no longer than a heartbeat, but it was an eternity. It was a scream of a soul trapped in a prison of its own making. Then it was gone. The connection snapped. He was back in his own body, the tip of the nutrient tube pressing against his lips. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a wild, frantic bird beating against its cage. He could taste the doctor's fear on his tongue, metallic and bitter, more real than any nutrient paste. He had seen the truth. The doctor wasn't his jailer. He was a fellow prisoner, locked in a cell of conscience, rattling the bars with his trembling hands. The sterile silence of the room was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghost of a shared and terrible secret. Aris Thorne stood in the sterile corridor, his back pressed against the cool, smooth wall, long after the door to 734's room had sealed shut. He did not move. He listened to the sound of his own blood roaring in his ears, a frantic tidal rush that threatened to drown out the low, ever-present hum of the facility. His hands, which he had shoved deep into the pockets of his lab coat, were shaking so violently they felt disconnected from his body. Two frantic birds trapped in white linen cages. He squeezed them into fists, his knuckles straining against the fabric, trying to force the tremor into submission. It was useless. The shaking was not in his hands. It was in his soul. That moment, that brief, impossible moment when their eyes had met, he had felt it. A flicker, a psychic probe, delicate as a moth's wing, that had brushed against the surface of his mind. He had felt it before, with the others. But this was different. It wasn't the chaotic, desperate flailing of a mind in distress. It was controlled, inquisitive. It was as if the